Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a good lunch, and welcome everybody back online. My name is Carlos Alcazar. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at NCST, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Julia Gordon. Ms. Gordon serves the Assistant Secretary of Housing and Federal Housing Commissioner at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate on May 12, 2022, which, by the way, I think we all watched, because it took forever to get to that point, and it was a super exciting day. So Ms. Gordon, that's right, thank you. Ms. Gordon is responsible for the Federal Housing Administration's single-family, multifamily, and healthcare mortgage insurance programs, HUD's multifamily assisted housing portfolio, HUD's housing counseling program, and HUD's manufactured housing program. So she's got a lot on her plate. Throughout her career, Ms. Gordon has been both a strong advocate for and hands-on practitioner working to achieve equal justice, fairness, and equity in housing and consumer protections. Prior to joining HUD, Ms. Gordon was most recently the president of the National Community Stabilization Trust, which is now NCST, by the way, we've shortened it, and has also held leadership roles at the Center for American Progress, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and a Center for Responsible Lending. So please join me in welcoming my friend and our keynote speaker, Commissioner Gordon.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am so happy to be here. This is sort of like the FHA commissioner version of a family reunion. And as Carlos mentioned in his introduction, I'm a past president of NCST, and I've worked closely with the Urban Institute's Housing Finance Policy Center since its founding. So it won't be surprising if I say to you that I hold both of these organizations in extremely high regard. But even if I'd never had those roles, I would still tell you that both of these organizations are leaders in the effort to ensure affordable housing for underserved families and communities. And I'm, so proud of all the work that's being done out there. My approach to this work has in large ways been shaped by both of these organizations, and that inspires a lot of the work that I'm doing now at HUD. So speaking of work that's been done by organizations in this room, I want to use a story to kick off talking about what we're working on at FHA. So cast your mind back to early 2020, right when, well, I know those of us at NCST at the time were like, oh, all those CRL people are going home, but they're just being wimps. And then, 2 days later, we're all home. But as soon as that happened, the Housing Finance Policy Center jumped into action immediately. And, I'll take credit for being one of the people encouraging them to do that. And what they did when this happened was they realized how much this crisis was going to mean to homeowners and how bad things could get if action wasn't taken immediately. And they reconstituted a previously constituted body called the Mortgage Servicing Collaborative, and they rebranded it to be the Mortgage Markets COVID-19 Collaborative. And it brought together an emergency convening of consumer advocates, housing policy experts, industry stakeholders, all the people to talk about what collective actions needed to be taken to keep homeowners in their home, where keeping people at home was the single most important thing we could do to fight the public health crisis. And we knew that unemployment and illness were threatening the ability of people to stay there. And when I look back on the work of this collaborative, I really have two takeaways. First, the substantive work was absolutely critical to FHA, and I will also kind of speak for FHFA and the GSEs and VA and USDA in that it was part of everybody working together to come up with a solution. But the other takeaway for me was that we could all work together, because honestly, I thought this was one of the most collaborative times I've ever been involved with in my career. And the result of what we did, the creation of the COVID-19 streamlined forbearance, I think will go down as one of the most effective emergency government assistance programs ever. So I'm not here to talk about the FHA annual report that's coming out tomorrow, but something you'll see in there that I'm going to say here is that today, FHA's serious delinquency rates have returned to pre-pandemic levels. And for us, that means we went from what was close to a 12% seriously delinquent rate to what is now under 4%. We've helped approximately 2 million FHA borrowers stay in their homes, both first through forbearance and then through what has been a continually evolving set of home retention options. And these options have been so effective that we're now using them to help all borrowers facing financial hardship, no matter what the cause. We also know, however, that some of the tools that have worked so well during the pandemic are not as effective in today's higher interest rate environment. And to that end, maybe you've seen this, but some months ago, we placed on the drafting table a new program called the Payment Supplement that will allow borrowers to use their available partial claim funds, which for people who don't speak FHA, that's basically, it's basically a second lien. You know, it's like the GSE deferral, but it's constituted as a second lien. And they're going to be able to use that to subsidize their monthly mortgage payment for a period of time, because we know that payment reduction is the single most important factor in keeping people in their homes. Since that policy went on the drafting table, it got lots of comments, and this policy was also a collaborative policy. I'm looking around the room. I see lots of people we worked with on this. I know out in Zoom land, there's lots more of you that worked on this with us. And we are going to be putting that back on the drafting table for your final chance, hopefully by the end of this week. And, you know, as I pivot to talk about some other topics, I just want to underscore about how much valuing this type of collaboration underpins what I'm aiming for at the Office of Housing. When our team looks at our policies, what we're looking for is that triple bottom line. What are the policies that are good for homeowners and home buyers? What are the policies that are good for lenders, servicers, and other industry partners? And what are the policies that help support and keep the Mutual Mortgage Insurance Fund safe and sound? And we have found literally dozens of things to do that fit that criteria. And this work has never been more important. You know, as we sit here today, I don't have to tell anybody in this room that the promise of home ownership as a cornerstone of financial health and family stability is available to an increasingly small number of people. And, you know, we have an enormous gap in housing supply, particularly for starter homes, and home prices are less affordable than they've been in most of my lifetime. And that's why HUD and the Biden-Harris administration have made housing supply and affordability such a priority. And I'm just going to run through a couple of examples of things we've done lately before we get to the Q&A part here. One thing I want to talk about is our recent policy on single-family homes with accessory dwelling units, which some people call ADUs. We put out policy that says not only can you count existing rental income from that unit when you are being underwritten for a mortgage on that home with the ADU, but we will even count prospective income. And here's the reason. We want to make it possible for more borrowers to buy homes with ADUs. And this policy does that, but we also want to encourage the creation of new ADUs. So our policy had to cover prospective income so that you could use it to, if you needed to, for, say, a renovation loan to create that ADU. And we think that the housing created by ADUs is often in places where it's the most needed. It can do, so much to help those homeowners build wealth. And it's an area that we're going to continue to look for opportunities in. Speaking of renovation loans, you will also soon see something up on our drafting table concerning updates to the 203K renovation mortgage program, which many of you have been asking for years. I know I was when I was in one of those jobs. I also want to talk about manufactured housing because that's an important piece of the puzzle. In the first half of 2024, we'll be finalizing a set of more than 80 changes to HUD's manufactured housing construction and safety standards, which some of you might call the HUD code, so that manufacturers can create new designs with features that are in high demand by consumers. If you've ever seen some of the new manufactured homes coming out, you can't tell that they're manufactured homes. But when we're doing all this, whether it's ADUs or manufactured housing, we are very mindful of local zoning limitations. That is a real problem. And to alleviate these constraints, HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development recently released, say that 3 times fast, the Pathways to Removing Obstacles to Housing, or pro-housing, which is way easier to say, notice of funding opportunity, which is going to help communities identify and address local building and zoning regulations that act as barriers to affordable housing development. I'll just give you a quick example because I see that my Chief of Staff, Nate Schultz, just walked in here, of how quickly small changes in zoning can make a huge difference. Nate was just in California talking about ADUs, and California's policy and zoning changes to encourage their production means that in California, they are now building around 100 ADUs a day. This is what we need. Another thing that FHA is doing to help increase affordable housing supply is looking to all of our asset disposition channels to make sure that all of them require a 30-day first look period where only owner-occupant, nonprofit, or government entities can purchase a note or property. And pretty soon, we will issue a proposed rule to establish a permanent structure and process for note sales, both forward and reverse mortgage note sales. And we are looking to streamline our direct note sales process. For those of you who have tried to do a direct sale with us, it's not streamlined right now, so that we can work directly with government entities and high-performing nonprofits to facilitate the sales that we know will benefit families and neighborhoods. So I'm going to wrap up there, but before I cede the podium here, there's so many people in this room I've worked with for so long. Don't be offended by this, but it is the honor of a lifetime for me to serve as FHA commissioner. And I have taken the passion, the experience, the mentoring, and the relationships I've gotten from all of you to work in this administration that is so deeply committed to making life better for families and communities. And the only other thing I'll say about that, we've accomplished a lot and we need more time. We need a lot more time. There's so much more we can do if we have more time. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you for being partners in our crucial work. And it is such an honor and a joy to do this work alongside you.
All right. Well, now begins the fireside chat. portion of our time with Commissioner Gordon. And I'm going to do my best to ask some questions, some of which I think you've already gotten ahead of me with those remarks. But and then we'll receive questions from our audience here and online. I want to begin by saying that I think for those of us who feel as if experience on the ground throughout your career in homeownership and housing policy and caring about that, and also people who understand that policy matters, not just in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., but on the ground in local communities. If you care about those two things, then having Commissioner Gordon in the position that she is in is just, kind of a dream come true. And I think no one, I'm going to claim this in the room, and I'm sure there are people who will challenge me on this, but I'm going to go out there and say it. No one is more proud of that than your NCST family. And I know on behalf of the staff who's assembled here and the number of alums and others board members as well, who have worked with NCST, we are so very proud. It was fitting for us, and this is obviously Urban hosts many events and they do such an incredible job, but it is NCST's first event that we've had the pleasure to host, and it was fitting that Commissioner Gordon keynote this for us. So thank you for being here. And you are now well into your second year as the FHA Commissioner. You kind of gave us a flavor of some of the changes that you've been able to make and some of the ones that are on deck. But what are you most proud of? And what are you looking forward to in the next few months?
So when you ask what I'm most proud of, I know when people ask that, sometimes they mean, which is your favorite policy? They're all my favorites. I don't choose among my children. What I'm most proud of is the way the entire Office of Housing team, all 2,600 and some, step up every day to do incredibly difficult work with constrained resources, with things like on any given week, not knowing if you're going to be working the next week. And I want to particularly shout out in this room, because I just talked about a lot of single family staff. When we saw this latest artificially created deadline looming, we said, well, let's try to do it all before November 17th. And if you have ever heard anybody say anything not nice about government career staff, you can go yell at them for me right now, because wow, did this team step up. And you can hardly sort of keep track of how much stuff we've done in the last couple of weeks. It's been a tremendous effort, and I am so proud of the entire team. Great. And wait, there was a second half of that question.
Well, what are you looking forward to?
Well, so not shockingly, we've developed a very, very long punch list now. I talked about a little bit of it. This next year is really about execution and about getting things out as much as we can. And yes, there's a certain, sometimes you kind of feel like you're the airplane on the tarmac and there's other airplanes ahead of you and you kind of have to wait and you're like, are we driving to Chicago? And it can be hard sometimes to get things out in as timely a way as we want to, but we have a lot of things planned, whether it's 203K or Title I for personal property financing for manufactured housing, or looking at the rules that govern house servicers manage foreclosure, looking at things like the flipping rule or the anti-flipping rule. There's a lot of these things on our plate, and we're going to get through as many of them as we can. But that's why I say we're going to need at least 4 more years to get everything done.
Agreed. We've become accustomed to seeing FHA release its annual report on November 15th, tomorrow. You've previewed for us that you'll have some updates on delinquency rates. Are there any other previews you can provide for our audience?
Well, all the news is embargoed until 10 a.m. tomorrow. But I can say that what you're going to see in this report is that we have shown that it is possible to meet your mission while also being, fiscally prudent and a good manager and a good steward of taxpayer funds. And I think that you'll really see that highlighted in the annual report. And I do want to shout out former NCST and now FHA staff person David Sanchez, who you'll see on a panel later, who has taken a very large role in helping produce the annual report.
Right. You mentioned a bit about in your list of policies that you all are working on, updates to the 203K program. And we heard at the top of our presentation today the state of the existing housing stock and the issues with deterioration in that housing stock. It's a very old housing stock, and there are many opportunities, many people feel, to unlock new supply if we can have access to renovation or rehabilitation financing. So can we double click a bit on 203K and kind of hear some more about what you see as FHA's agenda there?
Sure. I mean, hopefully the draft ML will come out on the policy tables, drafting table soon, so you can see it. There were a number of moving parts that we wanted to look at. We needed to look at the streamlined program versus the full program, and what the cutoff between those was. We needed to look generally at limits of what you can take out. We needed to look at the whole consultant process, which I know has been problematic for a lot of people. So what you're going to see when it comes out is, and all of, as is true with all policy work, you're trying to avoid unintended consequences. You're trying to only have those consequences that you wanted. And everything is a trade-off all the time. So what you're going to see, I think, and what we want your feedback on is some efforts to maybe cut things up a little bit differently than they were previously, just to try to break out of some boxes that we might have artificially been in. But your feedback is really important. As I think folks know, we did an RFI on this earlier this year. We did get lots of great feedback. We tried to take it all into account while we were crafting the draft ML, but now is this other opportunity to get feedback. And just a little commercial for the drafting table. The drafting table is the best thing since sliced bread. It is this amazing tool that we have when we are putting out sub-regulatory guidance, that instead of us just looking at each other and saying, yeah, we think this is good, and putting it out there, and then having people say, that doesn't work, or you used the wrong word, and now it's going to mess everything up. We're trying to put it out there before we finalize it so that everybody can take a look at it and catch things like that. It may be that some big chunk of the policy is something that we have done a lot of research on, a lot of analysis for, and can't necessarily change. But so much of this is open to that kind of feedback to help improve it. And so for anybody here on video who hasn't used the drafting table before or commented on a policy we put there, I really encourage you to take a look at this one, which I know is so important to everybody who came here today.
Thank you. One of the cornerstones of FHA's work during your tenure has been to retool the disposition strategies to give owner occupants, home buyers and nonprofits a leg up when competing for distressed properties. Can you give us a little more detail on why this was important to you and what you think the benefits are?
Well, it was important to me because I had just come from spending 6 years in disinvested neighborhoods and seeing what vacancy and blight does to them. And I thought the way disposition programs were being run was contributing to that blight. And I wanted that to stop. Still want that to stop. There's a lot of work we still need to do in this area, but the team, and we have Marlene here and we have David here. The team has done an enormous amount of work. A couple of things that are also coming out soon enough that I feel like I can telegraph they're coming out. We should have a proposed rule on note sales out. I think I might have mentioned that in my remarks, and that is, comes directly from my experience in the note sales community. And we are continuing to look at our REO policies, our claims without conveyance of title policies, and our note sales policies, both the auction sales and hopefully more direct sales. Now, I will tell you, this is not easy stuff to work through. It's been a long haul. It very much involves the Office of Management and Budget along with HUD. And it involves a lot of different teams within HUD. It's taken a while to move that ball down the field, but I think we've done that very, very well. And I will sort of further say, when you see the things we're doing, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make it easier to get our properties, wherever they come from, back into the hands of homeowners, and to get them, quickly retooled so they are no longer a blight to a neighborhood, but are an asset to a neighborhood. We do know there is one piece of this process at HUD that's, I would say, broken, which is right now the ability for nonprofits to qualify under these rules. And it is, that is also on the immediate agenda to work on.
And that kind of feeds into my next question, because we were, in talking about access to distressed property sales, expanding that to a larger community of nonprofits. And we know in some markets we have, declining property values. In the high cost markets and the very competitive markets, competition for those properties is different than in our declining markets. And one barrier to nonprofit access to those properties is the cost. And so can you talk a little bit about not only expanding access for a wider group of nonprofits, but also addressing discounts in declining markets?
So I think that whenever FHA does anything with respect to disposition, we have to model, what we're going to get out of whatever the new process is. And we work with OMB to get that approved. And that is what's going on in this whole area. We have some programs, existing programs, that provide discounts that don't work as well anymore because they were mostly related to REO policy, the REO portfolio. You all know the REO portfolio is extremely small now because so many other properties flow out either through note sales or especially through CWCOT, or the third-party sales program. And so we need to figure out how to apply some of the programs we had in REO and to extend them to CWCOT in particular. That is a work in progress. But the good news is I think we have the right people there to push this forward as much as we can.
Thank you. I'm not the only one asking questions today. We have questions from our audience both here and online with us. And if there are any of you here that would like to ask a question, I believe if we have a microphone to pass around. But while you collect your thoughts, We'll take questions that we're receiving online, and I'll read the first one here from one of our virtual participants. Thank you for your recent RFI on challenges with small balance mortgages. Can you share what approaches FHA is considering to support the origination of small balance mortgages in weak markets and under or disinvested communities, where in many places all other pieces of the homeownership puzzle exist, but only if that family can find a mortgage?
Sure, that's a really important question. So the results of the RFI on small balance mortgages were not super surprising, which is that literally every part of the whole mortgage industry is constructed such that, you know, people and organizations throughout the chain are compensated based on a percentage of the UPB. And so that's always going to drive work toward higher balance mortgages. There are a number of lenders out there trying to do something about this. There are lots of experiments with, you know, paying loan originators a salary rather than commission. There's different experimentation. But the fact is that a lot of this problem is just about compensation. And what FHA would like to do is to create a demonstration project where we are able to provide some financial incentives to put our thumb on the other side of that scale. That is in our requested budget. You know, requested budget, that's such a quaint term. And, you know, we would really love to see Congress let us have that funding. And you might ask, well, aren't you guys a big insurance company? Don't you make a lot of money that you could use for this? And if you want to hear all about the accounting rules and what money we can and can't use for what, see me later. But the fact is, in order for us to do something like this, we would need this to come through appropriations. So, you know, I hope you can all join us in supporting that effort. That said, there are certainly always things you can try to do without money. We have some ideas. We're looking at some things, and also always open, you know, to new ideas. But it is really important that we start seeing more mortgage availability at those lower price points.
Absolutely. Please pardon my mistake. We are not taking questions from the audience. You can actually use the QR code, which I know appeared earlier up there, if you would like to submit questions virtually, and they'll be read when we have them. We have another question. How does FHA hope to build trust with communities of color in low-income communities when creating affordable housing supply?
I think the best way to build trust is to deliver results and to show up on the ground. And we're trying to do both of those things. You'll see when the annual report comes out that we continue to be sort of by share of the volume that we do, we are, you know, by far providing. Most of our purchase mortgages are for first-time home buyers. You know, by far, most of our purchase mortgages are for first-time home buyers. And the share of mortgage, I'm saying this carefully because we're only, you know, whatever, 14% of the market or whatever we are at any given time. The number of our mortgages is not going to exceed the number that, you know, the GSEs make. But if you look at who we make our mortgages to, we are far more likely to make mortgages to Black families, to Latino families, to families living in rural areas than any other channel out there. And that's because we have a program that is designed for people not served well by the conventional market. We are flexible when it comes to credit scores. We are flexible when it comes to down payments. And we are seeing that success, especially with the mortgage insurance premium reduction we made this past year, which, you know, you haven't seen the prices go down on that many other things, right? That has not only allowed us to make mortgages more affordable for people so they have more money in their pocket each month, but by changing what the DTI ratio looks at like at the beginning, it gets more people eligible for home ownership. So these are the kinds of things we're doing specifically to address the needs of the neighborhoods that have been left out of the conventional market. We are out there busting myths about FHA. We know that sellers and lots of the people in the industry have a lot of myths about FHA and don't always want to sell to somebody with an FHA mortgage. We are aware of this. And when you look at that, you have to say, well, exactly who are you locking out now when you say you don't want someone coming with FHA financing? This is a very serious problem. So we are out there busting those myths. We've been having these things called house parties around the country, where we are reaching out to, particularly to communities of color, and particularly to young people, hence the name, and people way cooler than me do this. I turned a number that ends with a 0, and I am like so not cool anymore. But what we're trying to do is say, here we are. Our Office of Housing Counseling has a really amazing partnership with HBCUs and other minority serving institutions that is going gangbusters now, just trying to make sure that young people know this is something you can continue to aspire to. And we have this program that's here to meet your needs.
Great. The questions are flowing in now. And we're running out of time, so I'm gonna try to get through these as fast as I can. There's a lot of interest, as you know, on ADUs. You announced that prospective rental income will be included in the calculus for qualifying mortgage financing. There's a question about how is that specifically going to increase the number of ADUs? Do you have any projections or ideas about what we might see with ADUs? Supply, I guess.
We do have projections. I'm not sure I know them, unfortunately. But, I think the policy combined with, as we see sort of the zoning and land use changes that hopefully are gaining some steam around the country, it will be a significant difference. I mean, this is now a very, very serious source of supply in California and in some other areas. And I think that that's really pretty easily replicable and scalable.
Do you see a role for community land trust?
In case I haven't made it clear, we are in a crisis and there is a role for everything. I would never, I think there are some models that have proven difficult to scale for whatever reason. I am delighted there are people who continue to press on that and continue to work on it, because different things work in different geographies. They work at different points in the business cycle. They work for different audiences. They work for different electeds. And so we have to be doing all the things because this is just too important not to.
All right, I have two questions on an acronym that I know you've been expecting to hear about, HECMs. So I'm going to combine these questions on the fly if you all will allow me. Apologies to both of you who asked these questions, but we're running out of time. The question is about utilizing HECMs to increase home ownership for owner occupants, and FHA note sales has been selling HECMs loans with vacant collateral through note sales. Will FHA consider selling forward mortgages with vacant collateral for the same reason? Maybe it might be a little jump.
So there's a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff in there.
I can talk about reverse mortgages, and then I can talk about note sales, which note sales are mainly of reverse mortgages. That's not really reverse mortgage policy. Reverse mortgages, which is what HECMs are a really important tool for a lot of seniors who are house rich and cash poor, to put it bluntly. So many people are struggling, in retirement, with inflation and everything, and they need to tap their home equity. But for people who are on a fixed income, and especially people who are on the lower side of the income spectrum, it can be very hard to get a product like a HELOC, which tends to require the ability to, repay it through income and looks at credit scores and all of that. So reverse mortgages are a really important part of the puzzle. But this is an incredibly complicated product, and it's complicated for borrowers, and it's quite honestly complicated for people who are in the business. And so what we have been working on is to try to make this product better across the board, better for the market participants who offer and service these mortgages and securitize them. Ginnie Mae is also working very hard on these issues. They securitize our mortgages, and also to make the product a better one for borrowers, easier to obtain loss mitigation if you need it, and making sure we have that strong housing counseling that really supports the program. So that's kind of the reverse mortgage side. On the note sales side, we have been selling reverse mortgage notes because that's the notes that we have. There is not a foreclosure wave of any kind going on the single family side right now. And the combination of our normal REO policies, which have been improved all over time, although I will say there's still more room for improvement, and the claim without conveyance of title path that is now much more expansive than it used to be. Right now, I don't see really a need to put most forward mortgages through a note sale. The exception is, vacant distressed properties. And that's where I personally really see a role for direct sales. You don't want just anybody to be in charge of these properties. We've tried that and we saw what happened. I think everybody here knows that when you see a lot of vacancy in a neighborhood and you try to figure out what's going on, it's not zombie foreclosures. It's notes that are held by investors and aren't doing anything to invest into that property. And so what we want to make sure is that properties like that go to the right kind of owner who is going to put them back into productive use in the community.
Great, and I should mention, for those not familiar, it's HECM's is home equity conversion mortgage. So I should have said that up front. We are close to running out of time. I do think we have another time frame, maybe 2 more questions. What implications will FHA's efforts to expand affordable housing supply have on closing the racial wealth gap?
Well, this is critical to closing the racial wealth gap. We know how much families are able to grow their assets through homeownership. And I want to distinguish 2 things. I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but I'll do it anyway just for fun, which is there's a difference between investing in a home as like an investment vehicle because you expect rapid home price appreciation. Because you know what, that's flattening out, and as you mentioned, in some places even declining. Home ownership builds wealth because every month you are paying yourself and not just paying the landlord. You are building equity over time. You are creating stability for the household. Higher home ownership communities are associated with a whole range of, social determinants of health and well-being, whether it's education or health or public safety. And that is what we want to give people access. Those are all the things that help build wealth. It's not just the amount of equity you have in your house, but it's just giving you all of these, collateral benefits. And that's why we do the work we do. We want every person or household or family who wants to achieve this to know, first of all, in this case, that there's a government agency here to help you, and also what it is you have to do and not do to achieve it. We want you to know you don't need 20% down. You can do this with much less. There's so much down payment assistance that you can even combine with an FHA mortgage, which already is a low down payment product. So, you know, this is something that's achievable. And for so many people, it makes all the difference in the world for their families' fortunes going forward and for being able to do that generational transfer of wealth.
Great. We'll have our last question, and I'm going to take moderator's privilege here. Sometime, we hope many years into the future, your tenure will come to an end. And you and your wildest dreams will have achieved all the things you want. What will remain for the next commissioner, and what would be your charge to them to focus on, given what you think is achievable and possible with everything that you're doing?
Certainly what I would hope for future commissioners is that they continue what I think we've started, which is this collaborative approach across all the different partners and stakeholders that we work with. I think that's really transformed us in a lot of ways. And anybody can do that from any political party if they want to. And that's because this is so important to the people of this country. I would just really encourage any successor to pick up the baton in that respect.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I think all of our attendees here have thoroughly enjoyed this. Congratulations on an already incredibly successful tenure, and we look forward to much more to come. And again, on behalf of all of your various families and constituencies gathered, but most of all, your NCST family, we're just so grateful and appreciative and proud.
Thank you so much. And I'm so proud of NCST doing its first policy event.
Thank you.
It's really exciting.
Please do.
See this one? Great. How's everyone doing today? Good? Good? What about over here? We're good? Good. So, we want to follow up. I mean, Commissioner Gordon is obviously a tough act to follow. We're going to do our best here to really kind of, I think, build on the conversation that has taken place so far, really by going a little deeper into some of the tools that the federal government has at its disposal to really address the challenges related to single-family supply. I am not the one who's going to be sharing those comments. I'm going to leave that to our esteemed panelists here, starting with my colleague Laura Arce from Unidos US, with Matt Josephs all the way on the end here, and with in the middle here David Sanchez from HUD, to really kind of again talk about some of the challenges. And look, we know some of the numbers. I mean, Dr. Goodman has already brought up some of the important issues related to I think not, the supply challenge, not just with respect to new construction, but in terms on the existing side as well. One of the things that we know is that the typical single family home is about 40 years old or a little above that, being built in about 1980. And so that I think brings up the challenge of, around, what are the conditions of those properties? How can we make sure that they find themselves in the hands of households so that they can do what I think Commissioner Gordon talked about, which is to build the wealth to ultimately, hopefully pass that on to future generations. So that's kind of the setup here. And I just want to start off, building on what we heard, David, from Commissioner Gordon. Talk a little bit more. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the tools that the federal government has at its disposal as we try to address this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for the question, and thank you for having me here today. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. I think just before I answer the question, I'll briefly introduce myself. So I am a special policy advisor. I have the privilege of working for Commissioner Gordon at the Office of Housing and Federal Housing Administration at HUD. And before that, I spent 2.5 years, most of the pandemic, at the National Community Stabilization Trust. So really happy to be home here today in a way. I think the commissioner hit on a lot of the tools that the federal government, or at least FHA, has at its disposal. And I'll talk primarily about FHA, although FHA is also consulted, if not in the driver's seat, on a lot of the other initiatives that are taking place across lots of different parts of HUD. I think that the changes that Julia talked about when it comes to the 203K program are absolutely critical. This is the beauty of a 203K program. It's really twofold. One is you can base the full mortgage amount on the after repair value. So you are essentially allowing people to borrow funds for repairs that haven't happened yet, and they're able to do it at the low rate of an FHA mortgage, and they're able to do it with the credit flexibilities that we offer in the market. When you combine that with something else Julia was talking about, which is the ADU change, I really do think we have a path where, with 3.5% down, a family will be able to purchase a property and possibly either with an existing ADU or construct a new ADU. And when we talk about how these programs are going to not just make more supply, but also make that supply available to people who it hasn't been before. I think a lot of people, say, yeah, they build a lot of ADUs in California, but it's rich people doing it with cash. I hope that we're going to be able to really make a difference there. Another lever that we talked about is the stressed properties. And I have both the benefit and the curse of speaking after the commissioner. So, a lot of what we're doing there has already been talked about. But I think it's critical that we look at every single tool that we have, because it's going to take a ton of tools, both to build more housing to get out of the supply crisis, and also to preserve the housing that we already have now in the way that we want it. We want these homes that are backed by FHA mortgages to remain affordable homeownership opportunities for people across the country. It's a little bit less about existing supply and more about new supply, but we also are spending a lot of time on manufactured housing. We are close to finalizing a few policies that I think are really going to make a difference in FHA's ability to support manufactured housing that is titled as personal property, also known as chattel. We are a big provider of financing for manufactured titled as real estate. So when the unit and the land are owned together, but when they're owned separately, the federal government, including HUD, doesn't play a big role in terms of backing those mortgages. And I think consumers suffer as a result. These loans tend to be shorter term, higher interest rates, fewer consumer protections. Those are all things that I think we could change if FHA starts to play a more regular role in assuring that financing is available for these types of units. So I think I'll stop there. Those are some of the things we're really excited about at HUD and the Biden-Harris administration. So thank you, Michael.
No, that's terrific. I think you really kind of brought up, I think, the diversity, I think, of the toolkit that is available, and potentially opportunities to sharpen those tools to really drive change. I mean, I think that's a welcome next step. Matt, we talked a lot about HUD. We kind of really talked about agencies and what they can do. Talk a little bit about Congress and kind of the tools that they have or potentially can have to address this challenge.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I'm Matt Josephs. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy for LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation. We're a national nonprofit housing and community development organization. We're a certified CDFI as well. We have offices in 38 local markets throughout the country. I think as a CDFI, we do a lot of lending and investing. We're big users of the low-income housing tax credit through our tax credit syndication group, new markets tax credits, and that's relevant in a moment for one of the things I want to talk about on the Hill. And I would also say, where LISC has really been focusing, we don't originate single-family loans, but we do make loans to developers that are doing single-family housing, and we also, in several of our markets, have home repair programs as well. So that's kind of where our foothold is in the single-family space. The biggest priority on the Hill for supply of single-family housing, and I heard it as I was walking in this morning, I heard a round of applause for the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. I thought y'all were applauding me because it happened right as I was walking in. But I'll take it anyhow. This program needs so much support and recognition. For me, it's for a lot of us, it's kind of the missing tool in community development tax credits, right? You have the low-income housing tax credit, been around since 1986, targeting rental housing, affordable rental housing for low-income families making less than 60% of rent. In 2000, they created a new markets tax credit, which has been a great tool for commercial revitalization, community facilities, businesses, and in some cases, home ownership. They have been able to find a way to use the credit for home ownership. So it's a tool that can be used for that, but is not widely used for that because it's a little more of a different mechanism. So the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, if I should just dive into it for about a minute or two, give a little overview beyond the applause points. It really tackles this appraisal gap issue, right? Where the cost to develop or rehab a home is more than what you can sell the home for. So value gap, appraisal gap. Right now, no one's going to touch these homes because you're not going to make money on them. So the credit is designed to cover that gap, the gap between what the ultimate sales price or market value of the home is and the development costs you put into it. So if you have to put $200,000 into a home, but it can only sell it for $180,000, then you'd be able to get the $20,000 back through the tax credit to cover that gap. It's administered kind of like the housing credit because it goes through state agencies. So states would get allocated a formula of these credits, and then developers or sponsors, investors could come in and say, yeah, I want to develop, 50 of these homes. There's going to be a $10,000 gap on each home, so I need 500,000 in credits. They would have, if they're selected by the state agency, you would have 5 years to deploy these to line up your investors. And as each home is developed and rehabbed and then sold to an eligible homeowner, that's very critical. These are not for rentals. These are for sale properties. Then the investor can claim the credit. So it's kind of rolling basis. There's not a lot of investor risk at first because they're not putting their capital in until the home's probably ready to be turned over. It's probably the takeout capital. And if the gap ended up being less than they thought, then they may have more homes they can develop, right? They can use them for other homes. And if there's still some left over, they return it to the allocating agency. So there's really no windfall. It's not based on appraisals and perspectives of what you think the gap will be. It's an actual, you have the market value of the home. So it's a really effective program in that sense. It's targeted. It's only in communities that are of high poverty, low income, and low home values. It's an and test. And about 20% of the census tracts in the nation qualify based on the criteria. But state allocating agencies have flexibility to use another 20% of their allocation to work primarily in rural communities that may not meet all three of the characteristics. So they have some flexibility to tackle rural communities because, this is a problem, not just in like the Detroits and Clevelands and Baltimores where you have a lot of vacant housing stock, but also in rural communities where development costs are really high, where the incomes might not support a new home. So you could kind of address the problem in rural communities as well. So that's the general nuts and bolts. There's a Neighborhood Homes Coalition, no, Neighborhood Homes Investment Act .org is a website where you can, there's a mapping tool you can use to see what qualifies, and there's a lot more information about this legislation. Briefly, it's HR 3940 in the House. It's Representative Kelly from Pennsylvania and Higgins from Buffalo. And it's got about 40 co-sponsors, pretty evenly split with Democrats and Republicans. On the Senate side, it's Senators Cardin from Maryland and Young from Indiana, about 10 co-sponsors, again, evenly split. So I think that's the top priority for legislation that can really make a dent in the housing supply. We anticipate that you could do 500,000 homes over the next 10 years if this legislation is enacted. If I have a couple more minutes, I'll just name check some other pieces of legislation that are at least interesting, even if they may not be moving right away. Representative Marcy Kaptur from Ohio introduced the Restoring Communities Left Behind Act. That's HR 837 with about 15 other Democratic co-sponsors. And that authorizes a new program at HUD. So, get ready to support grants to mission-based partnerships to carry out affordable homeownership and neighborhood revitalization plans. Funding can be used for homeowner rehab assistance, weatherization, housing counseling, a pretty broad use, but the focus is on homeownership. So I think that could be an interesting program. Representative Ferguson from Georgia and Kildee from Flint, who should be very familiar to the NCST crowd and the Center for Community Partnership crowd in particular, has introduced legislation for a national land bank network, right, to provide critical support to land banks throughout the country run through the Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation. On part of the panel this morning, we talked about the other problem of like outside investors gobbling up homes in lower income neighborhoods, taking those, that's removing homeownership opportunities from those neighborhoods. Senator Brown and 8 other co-sponsors, including Senator Wyden, who's the chair of the Finance Committee, introduced legislation called the Stop Predatory Investing Act, which would kind of try to put curtail the tax advantages investors of bulk properties owning more than 50 or more single-family rental homes can take for those properties. And lastly, I wanted to just do a quick shout out for, I think, another one that was mentioned this morning, more on the administrative side, less the hill, but the Capital Magnet Fund is a program at the Treasury Department for CDFIs and nonprofit housing developers that primarily is used for rental housing, but can be used for home ownership. And the CDFI fund invited public comments that were due a month or 2 ago for improvements to the program. And one of the things we let in on were some changes they could make to make it more friendly for home ownership. So I think that's one to keep our eye on too on the administrative side.
No, this is expansive. And, I think one of the things that we really want to portray is, not just the steps being taken by the federal government, but how different parts of the federal government, the steps that each of them are taking kind of, I don't know if individually is the right word, but separate from, other parts of the federal government, and seeing that kind of variation, so to speak. And then the next step is to really start to kind of layer on some of the challenges, some of the intersecting challenges that could be taking place. That is that the challenge of housing supply is not happening in a vacuum. There are other really key issues that are happening, and how can we ensure that the policies remain robust to those issues? And so I'm going to bring in Laura to really start us off with particularly racial equity, and what should be the racial equity considerations. Kind of a 2-part question, what should supply look like in order to really close the racial homeownership gap?
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael. Big question. First, it's really great to be here. Thank you to the Urban Institute and our friends at NCST, Chris and the team, for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I'm Senior Vice President for Economic Initiatives at Unidos US. Unidos US is the country's largest Hispanic civil rights organization. We've been around for about 55 years, and we're a multi-issue organization. We work across lots of different topics that are important to the country. And the way we do our work crosses policy, advocacy, programs, applied research, communications. So we do lots of different things. Increasing Latino homeownership is an institutional priority for my organization. It's what I focus on in my day-to-day job. And the reason we're so focused on homeownership in particular, it really boils down to three core reasons. The first is, that we've heard a lot about today, is the importance in homeownership in building generational wealth. And it's interesting, the last panel in particular, they unpacked that a bit about there's different ways to think about that wealth building element of homeownership. And one piece that I want to add to when we do the calculus, because I know today the math on homeownership is challenging. But one thing homeownership provides is that stability, that predictability in your monthly housing costs, which is something you do not get with rent. And that's something that's incredibly valuable, particularly over time. So there's that element of the generational wealth building. A second core piece is, I noted that we're a multi-issue organization. We work in education and health, workforce, lots of different topics, civic engagement. And we continue to see in my organization the positive correlation between home ownership and other social outcomes in a positive way. So for that, we see that as a very important connection point. And lastly, for Unidos, focusing on Latino homeownership is a priority because we know for our community, homeownership is really important. And so we survey the Latino community pretty regularly and consistently when we ask, what homeownership represents to you, the words that come across most frequently are family and stability. And those are evergreen values, and no matter where we are in the economic cycle, that people really value. And so if it's important for our community, it's something we're certainly going to focus on. Earlier this year, we launched a new initiative, the Home Ownership Means Equity Initiative, or HOME Initiative. And we set a really big goal to enable systemic change to help create 4 million new Latino homeowners this decade. So that's a really big transformative goal. But when we're successful at the end of this decade, we'll still have, that still will not close the Latino homeownership gap. There's still a lot of work to do. So it really points to the importance of all the work we need to do. In today, certainly there are multiple headwinds for Latino and other first-time homebuyers of color in the market today. In our view, the lack of supply is the biggest of those headwinds. And for Unidos, the inventory issue that we're talking about all day today, it's a civil rights issue because we see it as key to closing that wealth gap in this country. So in terms of turning to, what are the solutions? One thing that, I want to, underscore, because I've heard it stated repeatedly, we need all the tools from the toolbox. We need them all on the table, and we need to think about, having all the options there because the problem is so big and it's so challenging, and the gap is huge. And what tools we use are going to differ based on what region of the country we're in, the type of community we're working in. But I'll share kind of 5 just very big ideas that we're focused on in terms of solution on the inventory crisis. The first is the need to increase density and through zoning reform. We've heard a lot about zoning already earlier today. The second is thinking creatively about how we build or construct housing. So whether it's factory-built housing or focusing on this existing stock. I was really struck by Lori's comment earlier today about reducing the obsolescence rate and being able to focus on not losing so many of the units that are already out there today. A third is being open to different types of ownership models, whether it's co-ops, community land trust, shared equity models. Again, we need all the tools on the table, and what's appropriate for different communities is going to differ, but we need to be open, both we as practitioners, as well as how we talk about these options in the communities that we work in. A fourth key element that I'm going to raise is immigration reform. We need to rebuild the workforce in our construction and trade industries. And I believe that immigration reform is a really key part of that solution. And then 5, pointing to some of the solutions that, Matt and David raised already, is we need public investment in infrastructure and housing.
I mean, I applaud such a robust strategy. I think you bring up exactly an important point, which is we need all of the tools on the table in order to fight this challenge. And, one of the things I'd like you to just comment on this a little bit more that I think you were getting to is around affordability and how important, not just putting the product on the ground, but making sure that it's affordable, particularly in communities of color. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I think So the inventory and the affordability challenges, they're related, but they're different. So certainly in many communities, there aren't enough houses to buy. But then when you think about the affordability piece, like I know from the most recent data I saw from Freddie Mac, they estimate there's somewhere around 8 million mortgage-ready Latinos out there today. So, I always like to remind folks, I work with them like, okay, those 8 million paired up, we've just reached our 4 million goal for the end of the decade. The challenge is that even if they have the right credit profile, if they're that right age range, stage in life when they're ready to buy a house, that doesn't mean there's a house out there for them that they can buy within what their incomes. And for the Latino community in particular, and this is true in a lot of communities of color, that there are historic, income gaps and differences in terms of what those access to employment opportunities are, which is, very much correlated with the wealth gap relationship. So there's a lot of challenges, but getting your foot in the door. But we need to make sure that we're building homes. And I know there was a conversation earlier about, the starter homes and forever homes. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. But when I think about starter homes, I think about it from that price, in that being able to, that first-time home buyer maybe doesn't have tons of savings, doesn't have the generational wealth. Is there a house out there that they can afford to buy for that beginning piece?
No, just amazing comments, just reminding us of how important it is, I think, to get onto the rung of home ownership and what we need to do in order to do that. David, we've talked, we've applied a racial equity lens, and we want to keep coming back to that in this conversation. But we know that there are also other cross-cutting challenges taking place in the world today. I mean, one of those is climate change. How do you think about supply policies, again, being robust, not just to the racial wealth disparities that Laura's already talked about, but to the climate, and keeping in mind that they're kind of all interacting together. The climate may contribute to the racial inequities. And so how do you kind of think about that? How do you ensure, what are some of the steps that you ponder and really try to assess when developing federal policy around this issue?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that question. I think, given what we've been seeing in the world in recent years, it's been a few months since our summer of natural disaster summer is how I think of it. But it's become incredibly clear that we cannot make federal housing policy without thinking about things like resilience. That's true even on the financing side at a place like FHA, yet alone, the more subsidy or grant-driven programs that the rest of HUD is in charge of. So resiliency is a big commitment of the Biden administration, and a lot of work is underway both within FHA and outside of FHA. Within FHA, or within the Office of Housing, at least, we are responsible for the manufactured homes construction and safety standards. We feel pretty good about those standards. There were big updates in the early 90s around resiliency. But that being said, I think we're going to continue to look at the HUD code and what levers we have to ensure that manufactured housing is as resilient as it possibly can be. Just given, the predicted rate of disasters we're going to see is just simply going to be more than it was before. A lot of the resiliency focused work is also taking place in HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development, which is more of the grant making side of the house, and it's run by Marion McFadden at this point. They are consulting with FHA on a couple different rulemakings. One example is establishing floodplain standards and where properties that are supported by the federal government can be built, and if they are built in a high risk flood area, how much they need to be elevated. It's really, really difficult work because it makes the housing that should be the most affordable in a way. It really focuses on that housing stock. And it is true that, elevating units or restricting where they can be built does make housing more expensive. I think we've come to a point where we can no longer pretend that we don't have serious climate and resilience problems on our hands. But I think we're constantly going to need to be striking that balance between what do we need to do to make these homes resilient, but how do we keep them as affordable as we can, for the communities, the people who need to live in them.
Yeah.
I would also note, we talked about our 203K program, the renovation program. It's not incredibly tailored for resiliency upgrades or energy efficiency upgrades. However, it's very usable for those things. And we think that, over time, we're hopeful that, both in the market and we can react to that as FHA, as policymakers, we could be providing some of that funding that's needed to make homes kind of as resilient and as sturdy and as life-proof, I guess, as possible.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
think that's all right. Again, let me just kind of follow up here, and please, if anyone else has a comment, please chime in. It's kind of the same question that I posed to Laura, which is, you have this affordability on the other side, and you've kind of already talked about that. And, manufactured housing kind of comes to mind as a potential for resiliency married with affordability potentially. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is that a sensible kind of, do you see that product as a sensible kind of via media almost?
We do. I mean, perhaps it's no surprise that the organization that proffers the HUD code is excited about the manufactured housing sector and believes that it's a real source of affordable housing for the future. We think it's only going to get bigger and more popular as an option. I think the data shows, that there are just significant cost savings to building in a factory, yet alone, talking about different models where if someone is able to rent rather than own the land underneath, that can also, save them a good bit of money on what their monthly housing payment is. I think what I would say with manufactured housing is we just need to make sure we're doing it right. I think that manufactured housing, somewhat, I think wrongly receives a lot of stigma, but some of the stigma is correct because I think some low-income consumers have had an extremely problematic experience with their experience in manufactured housing. I think some of that's due to resiliency, some of that's due to financing, some of that might be due to, other problems in the construction or the siting process. I think that manufactured housing is such an opportunity that we need to seize it, but we need to be really careful and really intentional that we're creating sustainable and affordable home ownership that works as well for low-income people as it does for, the rest of the population.
That's right. And I think that hits on exactly, Laura, I think the point, that you were really driving at about some of the racial inequities and how we close them with the supply tools that are at our disposal at the federal level. And David, I think the other point that I think you brought up, which I think is critical, is the degree to which a product like a manufactured housing can overcome some of the challenges that builders tell us they're having with respect to the lack of labor, lack of productivity. This might be a product that helps to overcome some of that. But as you put the important caveat, we need to make sure that we're doing it right. And so that, Matt,
I
please.
wouldn't mind, adding to, a couple of the other federal opportunities to support the climate resiliency work and the Inflation Reduction Act included several, tax benefits for investing in this kind of clean energy, as well as funding programs, mostly at the EPA, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I don't know if folks are familiar with that initiative, but $27 billion with 40% to be targeted toward disadvantaged communities, part of the Justice 40 initiative, to really focus on getting investments in clean energy. And I'll do a quick commercial for LISC. So there was just a funding round for $14 billion of this funding. And LISC is partnering with Rewiring America, with Enterprise Community Partners, with Habitat for Humanity and United Way, and predominantly to focus on housing. So some of it's multifamily housing, energy retrofits and building new housing that's going to be, decarbonized, but also single family home repairs, getting new energy efficient appliances in the home, solar installation, and other groups are focusing on that as well. So a huge opportunity for single family, in addition to over $8 billion of tax credits that can be taken advantage of by homeowners to install these kind of appliances in their homes. So there's a lot of opportunity out there right now in the climate resiliency space. Also, the multifamily housing, right? The green energy.
GRRP, the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. So at HUD, we were proud to receive our one program under the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a $4 billion investment in essentially retrofits for HUD assisted properties. And other folks at HUD could tell you more about it. But we've put out those grants in a couple of different models. Some focusing on, really creme de la creme, let's do the best energy efficiency we can. For other buildings, we're looking about what are the kind of the most cost-effective per dollar approaches that we can find. So, we know we didn't get enough money to make the entire HUD-assisted multifamily stock green and resilient. However, I think that hopefully we're going to be proving out sort of how that work can get done and laying the groundwork for more of that work in the future.
This is exciting. I don't know if anyone in the audience is as excited as I am. But I certainly am, just from hearing everything. And so, let me follow up. Matt, you talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. Dave, you followed up with that. How do you get the word out? What are the strategies that you take, particularly at an organization like LIST, to be that bridge to get the information into the right hands to be able to take advantage of these opportunities?
That's a great question. With the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund dollars, the timing, I think the agency is expecting, EPA is expecting to make first quarter determinations. There's only going to be a handful of awardees. They're not under this $14 billion, which is the biggest pool of funding. They estimate 2 to 3 awardees nationally for $14 billion. So there's not going to be a lot of places to go to get this capital, which is challenging because you don't have 1,000 flowers blooming, but it's also, maybe it's an opportunity too, because there's only a couple places you can go to, right? So it is about getting the word out that these funds are available. I think articulating how they can be used, who the users are. I wasn't involved in the preparation of our application, but my understanding is Rewiring America has a robust kind of like system developed where you can kind of input your address and find out where contractors are and things like that. So that'll be the way, I think, to get it. And I don't want to speak too much on that because I really don't have that much knowledge except for that top line. And I do think technology is going to be a big solution too, to really hooking up people so they understand what their tax benefits are on the individual stuff, or where these funds are available if you're contractors, if you're trying to finance these projects where you can get cheap dollars from CDFIs to do that work.
Gotcha. No, that sounds like the beginnings of a strategy around the communication that's going to be critical to assure that the money finds its way into the right hands. But let me follow up on this. Matt, we talked about, you alluded to this in some of your initial comments. That certainly there's a challenge, in urban areas. And obviously we're at the Urban Institute, right? So, that's part of the reason why we want to focus there. But, you've alluded, there are challenges in rural America as well. Across some dimensions, you might think the challenge is even worse, particularly when we overlay racial equity. And so can you talk a little bit about, that intersection again of supply with the regional differences and what that means for?
Yeah, and unfortunately, you don't see as many kind of supply side tools, I think, in the USDA toolbox. You see some programs that do for home repair, but for home development, it's a little harder. The USDA is more focused, I think, on the lending side. And there is some legislation, the Rural Houses Services Reform Act. Then the biggest, this is S2790, is introduced on the Senate by Senators Smith and Rounds, so bipartisan legislation. That there's a big piece for multifamily housing, for rental housing, that's going to be very helpful about decoupling the rental assistance from the USDA financing, and so, which is important so you can keep these properties affordable when they run out of their 20-year mortgage stream. But on the single family side, there's something it's kind of nichey, but it's really interesting for the 502 Direct program. For native communities, they've made a relending program. So if you're a native like CDFI that wants to do financing instead, because usually it's a direct loan program, like a borrower actually goes to a USDA field office and gets a loan. It's kind of nuts that we're still doing that. It's great because it's a very cheap product, so it's awesome. But it's pretty wild. Like, you're going to go to apply to the USDA for my loan. But they really haven't. USDA was struggling, I think, to hit native communities. So they're working with CDFIs in those communities and having great effects. So they're trying to make this was a pilot program they're going to make permanent in that legislation. So that's something to keep an eye out for. There's also, they're updating rules for the home repair program, the 504 program. So it's less burdensome to get smaller loans. And they're generally modernizing the foreclosure process so they can cut red tape and better protect homeowners in their programs. So there are some tweaks in this. And again, Rural Houses Services Reform Act. There is hope maybe it could be part of a farm bill at the end of the year. It's standalone legislation, but you kind of look for any vehicle, you can get it done. And that's a must-pass bill, although now they're talking about extending the authorization for the farm bill for another year potentially. But these are the kind of avenues you kind of sneak these stuff in, and you can get small wins with a program like this. We're also for the 502 direct loan program. You can get interest rates as low as 1%. There's been an effort to double that to try to get, because they're trying to save money. And so they would raise the interest rates on these loans to kind of create. And so we're trying to push back on that because, the last thing low income potential home buyers need is higher interest rates right now. So we're pushing back on that a little bit. I think it's also important for the appropriations. They're not huge, but to support the 504 program at USDA, which is for home repair grants and loans, particularly for aging in place, elderly, those are important loans for that. And I'll give a quick shout out too for the new CRA rules. I don't know if we've are really going to dive into those, and we could spend a whole nother session on that. And I'm still, who's read the 1,400 pages? We all good? 14, how many? 1498, yeah, 1,500 pages. But I will give them credit. I'll give them actually a fair amount of credit for addressing a lot of issues some of us had raised in the proposed rules. But for this audience, I think they're really emphasizing investments in underserved communities, persistent poverty, Native communities. They're getting kind of like check marks, like good housekeeping seals if you're doing it in these neighborhoods. They call them impact factors. So they're recognizing that. And I think that'll help spread capital into those communities. The way they're doing their assessment under the community development test, they're looking at activities outside of the bank's assessment areas and giving more credit for that. So I think that'll really help spread the capital. They're also defining as a separate community development activity, homeownership housing. Not to be confused with your home loans, which you're doing, they're getting credit for under what they call the retail test, but under the community development test, if you're investing in community land trusts and land banks, if you're investing in development of single family homes, affordable to lower income people, that's a special category. So it's much more clear that you can get credit for that as well. So I think there's a lot that could help move the needle a little bit from the bank side.
Amongst everything that you said, there were so many points that I think were so critical. And Laura, please jump in on this too. That we think about certainly the loan representing this household is now a homeowner. But I think you also alluded to capital being invested in these communities and the potential for a virtuous cycle, simply from the investment, the capital, the money that's now flowing, when frankly, it may not have been, or it may have, but at higher prices. And so can you talk a little bit more about how you see those programs kind of along that dimension? And, Laura, chime in on any of this, but particularly, what does that mean for communities, not just in terms of home ownership, but also in terms of capital flowing into to communities of color, oftentimes underserved communities?
Yeah, I think for me, I'll start, I guess, for the programs we look at, it's all complementary, right? We need more housing supply. We need more starter homes that are affordable for lower income families. And that's where something like neighborhood homes comes in. But then on the supply side as well, and that's where the banks need to be able to provide the loans. They're still the primary source of lending, and they need to be able to provide the loans. There's down payment assistance programs, right? So that we can get the borrowers that are credit ready, just get that small down payment, that 3%, whatever they need. There's the housing counseling programs at HUD. So to me, it's all part of a mosaic that are kind of all interconnected. Yeah.
And I'll add on the capital piece. Certainly we think about the capital needed to construct and build housing itself, but we can't forget the infrastructure, the preparing of the land and all the infrastructure needs that go around that, whether it's roads and sewers, and depending on where you are, even like schools, if it's sort of newer emerging communities, and so all of that. Otherwise you could have housing, but then there's no community to it, if it's missing those amenities and the infrastructure.
I love that. I love that. I love the personal lens that you put on it. That certainly there's a dollar and cents conversation that is critical here. But there's a personal conversation around community, around stability, which is the way that I did at least include it when I thought about the home that I would ultimately live in and that my family would live in. It had exactly those additional components over and above the abstraction of dollars and cents. And so I'm really glad that you brought that into the conversation. You know, let me turn it a little bit here. You know, we have talked about the tools that are at the disposal of the federal government, either already in place or being created. You know, part of the reason why that's important is because the federal government can oftentimes standardize certain types of rules, or they can, you know, scale certain types of great policies. But maybe an alternative way to think about that is to build up. You know, there might be some policies at the local level, some steps being taken at the local level that themselves could be scaled nationally in a way that might mimic kind of a federal response. And so, you know, let me just start with you, Laura, continuing that conversation around, you know, what are you seeing on the ground that has that type of potential?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I should say, you know, I'm from California, so I feel like part of that is I'm an optimist kind of by nature. Living in DC and working in DC for as long as I have, sometimes that's a hard, you know, trait to maintain. But where I actually have a lot of optimism on this whole big, messy question of inventory is when I go outside of Washington and I see what's happening in other communities. And so I'll share two, I guess, trends or things that I'm seeing that for me are really big bright spots. The first is around policy and specifically zoning, which we've talked a fair bit about today. And so I recently learned that accessory dwelling units, ADUs, which we've talked a little bit about today, ADUs are the gateway drug to zoning reform. So it's the way to open the door a little bit to, you know, folks who generally would push back on, if you call it higher density or other types of zoning. So ADUs kind of have a different tinge to it. And so we've talked about California and just some of the incredible policy changes that happened there. But there's been zoning reform in places like Maine, in red rural states like Montana. I mean, places that you wouldn't imagine. You know, last year, Arizona got pretty close to passing statewide zoning reform. It didn't pass, but just a couple months ago, it passed in Phoenix. So, you know, it's maybe growing from kind of the local level out. And so I see a lot of, you know, good possibilities around zoning trends, you know, beginning in different communities. What's interesting is depending on the type of community you're in, you're going to message the zoning and ADU and density conversation differently. But there's, I think, a lot of momentum across the country in local communities and its statewide initiatives that I think will kind of be sort of a blanket. And if we could do something on the federal side to provide more incentives for those sorts of policy changes, I mean, I think it really would transform. So that's one big bright spot I'm seeing. The second is, you know, the creativity and innovation I'm seeing from nonprofit community-based developers. And so I'll share a few examples of some affiliates that are part of the Unidos US network of some of the really incredible work we've seen. So there's one organization we work with in rural Arizona called Comité de Bienestar, and they build subdivisions in rural Arizona, and they focus on first-time home buyers, and they use so many of the tools. Like one I wanted to add to the conversation about tools for rural, you know, America, sweat equity, self-help programs are really important in rural markets, and they've used that tool incredibly well. And so they're building housing, single-family housing in the like 210 to 230,000 price range. You know, in rural Arizona, it's really incredible. And even in rural areas, they're playing with, you know, kind of innovating with more higher density. So townhouse development, which you don't often think of as a type of stock for rural America. So that's happening in rural Arizona. We have another affiliate in Southern California, San Isidro, so just kind of a suburb of San Diego, basically, which is one of the highest cost markets in this country. And they're thinking really ambitiously and creatively, and they have a light tech development that they have plans for over time when their period is over for the light tech of converting that to ownership using a co-op model. And so it's really, really interesting kind of how we think about the different types of ownership models. And then another example, I know we talked earlier about Chicago. We have an affiliate in Chicago working in Pilsen and Back of the Yards that I think is part of that, the vacant lot program that the city has, the Resurrection Project. And they're doing infill development using modular construction, in Chicago, which I think is really exciting. And, and it's a lot of it's like you have to just try new things. Like one thing we've learned from TRP's experience with the modular, at least right now, it doesn't actually bring your costs down that much, but it dramatically speeds up the process. So I think with that speed up of the time, and especially in places like Chicago, where you have the partnership with the city, being able to use vacant land. And I am very, bullish on a lot of the factory built models that over time will be able to bring down the cost to make that help to really to be able to contribute to that. So all that to say is I have a lot of reason for us to be optimistic based on the policy zoning reforms that I'm seeing in local communities, as well as these, community-based developers that are really rolling up their sleeves and thinking out of the box.
No, that's let me say that is really encouraging to hear. I mean, at the end of the day, I was always taught that housing is local. And to hear the amount of activity going on, I mean, we heard it earlier today, you're reminding us again that it's that local activity that's really driving and rejuvenating some of the steps that need to be taken here. And let me just really quickly, David, let me bring you into the conversation here because, Laura talked a lot about zoning. And, when I start to think about manufactured housing, you're thinking about the building code. I mean, national building code right there. Talk about, some of the benefits that kind of gives to you and to HUD as it tries to address the lack of supply.
Yeah, definitely. So it's true as you reference, homes that are constructed to manufactured homes that are constructed to the HUD code, which are oftentimes made in the same factories as what we call modular housing. They essentially, if they meet our HUD code, they are deemed as meeting the construction and safety standards that would govern their placement in communities across the country. So it's the only, people say it's the only preemptive federal housing code that exists. And as far as I'm aware, that's true. It does not solve all of the zoning problems when it comes to manufactured housing, unfortunately. There are, people still restrict the ability to cite single units, and there are especially strict local barriers to creation of new manufactured housing communities in particular. And it's gotten to the point where we don't really see that many new manufactured housing communities coming into existence. And when you consider that like half of all new manufactured homes are placed in communities, it really is a problem, and it's not one that we can fix just through the HUD code. I do think we've seen, as Laura referenced, a lot of really positive movement on local zoning, and we've seen a lot of great examples across the country. We have seen some of those successes in manufactured housing, but I don't think it's quite as mainstream yet. I think manufactured housing sometimes still struggles with a reputation or stigma problem that I think gets in the way of local officials thinking, boy, I really want that in our community. Where and at HUD we want the housing in the community because we think it's good housing. Yeah, I think we still have a little bit more work to do there.
You should start with manufactured ADUs. I'm telling you, it's the gateway drug.
Absolutely.
No, this is excellent. Again, I appreciate the nuance that I think is critical when we're thinking about policy development. That what are the ways in which it works, but let's be aware of some of the shortcomings so that hopefully at some point we can find a way to actually overcome those as well. But David, what I also heard kind of through your comments was this relationship between the federal government and local governments. And I want to just push on that a little bit, but with everyone. Can you talk about, it feels like that's going to be necessary in order to ultimately solve this challenge. It's going to take the entire ecosystem. It's going to take the federal government. It's going to take the local governments. It's going to take other change makers. Talk about kind of what that means for you, how you see that playing out in an optimal way.
I'll just offer a first crack at that. I really, so we are authorized by law to do certain things as HUD. We're primarily a mortgage insurer, or in a more general sense, we provide financing. We can't originate loans. What we essentially need to do is we need to build our programs to be as attractive to a wide array of private sector stakeholders as possible. We need to have lenders interested in originating loans. We need to have, lenders or housing counselors or something like that, getting qualified borrowers into the homes. If in something like our 203K program, Julia referenced the updates that we will be publishing soon. Most of those, I would say, are tweaks that will just attract more people to doing 203K loans, because that's really what we found is, we can make a tool available, but if people aren't using it, that limits its impact. So that's just one thought.
Yeah, I mentioned like LISC has been created some home repair programs in some of our markets, and it started in Detroit with kind of an innovative pilot program, and a prime source of funding for that was CDBG. So here you have these federal pass-through dollars the localities are using. That has been a really good source of funding for that. There's also the home program at HUD, but there's some limitations again on how well that can be used for single family home ownership programs. But yeah, the resources are out there. CDBG is one that will be there, for a while. We'd like to think. Whereas you can always go chasing these fleeting things that may not be there in a couple of years, particularly if there's a new budget environment. That's a source of funding, and maybe there's a role HUD can play in kind of promoting certain, hey, this is how CDBG was used here. Like kind of put out some case studies and things like that, because that can be a good source of funding.
Yeah, and I'll add that Nidos, we're a civil rights organization. We're an intermediary, so we're not making loans. We're not building housing, but we think we have an important role to play in this crisis that our country is facing around inventory, and we believe strongly that there's a role for all of us. I think everyone needs to be at the table, both federal, state, local, as well as the private sector and others. At Unidos, we think about it, kind of building a movement and raising up kind of this national voice, and making sure our policymakers understand the importance of this issue. And for us, what we think our role is certainly on the policy and advocacy front, whether it's here in Washington or in some of the states where we have offices where we work, like Florida, Texas, California, and Arizona. I think also, research is really important. We're really proud to have partnered with the Urban Institute around, some body of research around Latino homeownership. And we, recently, earlier this summer, we published, a research agenda and recently issued a call for papers, because we think there's still a lot that we need to better understand around what the opportunities and challenges are, both for policy making, but also for private market practices, because we need both the private market and policymakers, at the table to fix, the challenges sort of in this landscape. So I think, we all need to be there. And I think, I'll just close with saying that I think we also need to be nimble. I mean, the thing with housing, and you all know this because you're in this room and you're listening, so I'm going to assume that you're a houser. Things shift, right? Based on, you don't know what's going to happen with the market tomorrow or a year from now in terms of rates or the economy. Policy winds will shift. You may have heard we have an election in about a year or so. And so those factors heavily influence what the condition of the housing market is and what's doable and what's not. And so going back to the metaphor of you having all the tools at our disposal, we also need to be ready to kind of put one down and pick up a different one if conditions change. And I think that's part of being this coalition and making sure that we're all bringing our assets to the table.
Let me say that the challenge may seem daunting from what we've heard, but I think this event, everyone who has come to speak, all of you have really kind of made this point that we can do this. and that there are people in all different parts of the ecosystem who are focused on making the changes that they can make. We've got some questions from the audience, but before I get to them, let me just kind of recap a little bit here. I mean, we talked about, we started off talking about the challenge itself, and I know we had already heard about it, but we reiterated the challenge, and with a particular focus on what the federal government could potentially do or is already doing to address it. And then we overlaid it, keeping in mind that this is not a challenge that's happening in a vacuum. There are other issues at play that we also feel like we want to address with these tools, whether it's racial equity, whether it's climate change, ensuring geographically that we don't have too much variation, that rural areas, the challenges that they're facing that we're able to address those as well. Coming to this conversation, well, federal government, are there things that we can scale from the local level that ultimately can have a similar impact almost, with kind of an ending conversation around, well, how then can we partner with local level, with others in the ecosystem, ultimately in order to achieve the change that we want to see. And so, with that kind of as a description of hopefully, I think what I heard, and maybe even how I've guided the conversation a little bit, I want to start off, with you, Laura, taking questions from our audience. You talked about the housing shortage and what it meant for Latinos.
Mhm.
How do you think about the considerations? How do you think about the differences in a state like a California versus a state like a Florida, a state like a New York? How do you think about those differences and maybe where those needs might even be different?
Yeah, no, I think this goes back to the earlier point that it's, we can talk about the challenges kind of at a national level in broad strokes, but the solutions will have to be targeted to the different regions of the country where we're thinking more, urban, high cost areas versus, more rural communities, and in terms of what's possible. And so, for us, one of the benefits with, one of the assets of Unidos US is we have a national affiliate network. And so we can think about the resources in a broad way, but then we can target them with our affiliate network who are working in local communities. So certainly, like in a state like California, when I'm in California, the big things people talk about are, climate resiliency in building. And it's sort of this double-edged sword because it's imperative. I mean, there's no denying that we have to focus on climate resiliency in building new homes and refurbishing existing stock. But we also can't get away that adds to the cost. So how do we think about that? How is that covered? And how do we think about maybe the long-term costs over time? This question of ADU, certainly, I think, in California, especially with recent changes, enacted not too long ago, that it will allow for, the, condoizing of an ADU. So it's not only, additional rental stock, but it's also potentially homeownership stock, I think could be a really, big game changer. But, thinking about, condos in more urban areas, self-help housing in more rural areas, modular and other, and manufactured housing, again, it's going to be based on the community for what makes sense. But I think we just need to have all those tools at our disposal and then think about what resources are needed, in those. And a big part of what I do is I really like to elevate the work that's happening in local communities so people see what's doable, so people get inspired about, oh, this happened in Chicago, maybe we can do that in Orlando, or, in Houston, thinking about what cities are similar that might be able to kind of build on each other.
No, that's excellent. And, I'm going to open this question up to the entire panel. One of the things that we like to say around the Housing Finance Policy Center here at Urban is, that housing production has been mid. And what we mean by that is that, we've seen a bit of a recovery, but we're a bit of an increase, but nowhere near the robustness that needs to happen in order to solve these challenges. And so, one of the issues, obviously inflation been a big issue. I mean, certainly the numbers today suggest that it continues to slow. But how has inflation played a role in terms of really complicating the steps that we're all trying to take and that each of you individually are trying to take toward closing these challenges?
I mean, probably in at least two ways, right? One is the interest rates are now going up to combat inflation. They're raising the rates, so it's making homes that were, a year ago affordable to lower income families are no longer affordable. They can't make the monthly payments now, given the higher rates of interest. That's one. And then just the rising cost of construction, right? And that's inflationary, but it's still some post-COVID supply chain disruptions. I think, Laura, you touched a little on the labor issues when you talked about immigration, and that's true. There's just not enough jobs to fill this, and I don't know how much of that can be tied to recent changes in immigration policy or not. But I'd be very interested, topical area. So I think those are some of the challenges you're seeing that are just kind of raising the costs for development.
No, I agree with Matt. And I would add a third is inflation has also, from the demand side, has made it more challenging for families to save up for a down payment. Their monthly expenses have shot up, and the disposable or discretionary money that they can put away toward a down payment, one, it's not going as far because of the rising costs, but it's harder to save that money. So it's sort of double-edged sword.
No, that's what I'm hearing. I mean, you think a basic market of supply and demand, it's having implications not just on the demand side, not just on the supply side, also on the demand side, but that the two are interacting at the same time, which adds, I think, to the complexity of everything. David, one of the questions that, we received, and I want to kind of start this off with you is, how do the limited consumer protections on most manufactured housing properties affect the ability of lower income households and households of color to access and sustain new affordable housing supply?
Oh, yeah.
That was a mouthful, so I can go back.
I think I got it. So it's actually, I think it's a great question. I think it's a really important one to talk about. So, I do think it's important to be distinguishing between manufactured housing that's done like most single family homes where, it's placed on private land, the land and the home are titled together. And that financing comes from a mortgage. We've had a tumultuous history with mortgages in this country. I mean, I remember when I was getting into this field, we had just caused a global financial crisis. I'd say that the mortgage space is pretty well regulated at this point. And I think, interest rates being whatever they are, by and large, consumers get a pretty good deal when they take out a home mortgage in this country. When it comes to financing for manufactured housing that isn't titled with the land, those loans are simply more expensive. Very few people originate them. There's not a lot of competition. People pay higher interest rates. So you have problems, just there to begin with the financing. I think that there are also issues to be confronted because if you own your home, but if you don't own the land underneath it, you can be extremely vulnerable to, the person who does own the land underneath it. We've seen, over the past decade or so, private equity firms and other private investors have figured this out, that, these low-income homeowners are kind of half homeowners. This is why investors have been buying manufactured housing communities. This is why they've been, raising the rents in those communities. We kind of colloquially, or we used to call manufactured homes mobile homes, but they're not really mobile. Most are never moved. And even if it were going to be moved, one, it might damage the house, and two, it'll probably cost more than the home itself is worth. So I do think we need to be moving in a model that is closer to mainstream home ownership kind of on both sides across the manufactured housing industry. That would be what I would advocate for. So I think there's, protections that need to be put in place in terms of, some people call them tenant pad lease protections, kind of security of land tenure, protections for people who live in communities. And I think, we're going to have to do a lot of work also looking at the financing side, making sure that any loans that FHA or if Freddie Mac enters the space next year, that they are backing, they come with kind of appropriate consumer protections.
Please, Laura, jump in.
I just wanted, it's such an important distinction because, we talk about manufactured housing and kind of all the opportunities, but that distinction between owning both the home and the land, and then that separation of owning the home but not the land. makes, these homeowners incredibly vulnerable. I was just in Phoenix recently, and this issue of the private equity coming in, we talked about it earlier in the single family space, but it's happening in the manufactured housing community space as well. And in Phoenix recently, 3 communities, what many people think of as mobile home parks, closed, displacing hundreds of families. The city of Phoenix, which is already facing a homelessness crisis, had to step in and figure out what to do with these hundreds of families. And it really opened their eyes, the need focused on this kind of hidden part of our affordable housing stock. So I just want to give a plug to Rock USA and the resident ownership cooperative model that connects back and being able to still kind of have that separation, but gives homeowners that control and power over the land that their house is on, which I think is a really key part. Otherwise, if you separate it and if you're renting your land and your landlord can change your rents with very little notice, I question whether that is true home ownership.
One of the things that I hear is that it's not just enough to get people into the homes. We need to make sure that they're able to sustain it and ultimately the benefit from home ownership as well. And I think that that's a critical addition, I think, to this conversation. Let me actually follow up with another question for you, Laura. Though, Matt talked about ways in which we can get the word out. Especially with all of the federal policies that are coming down the pipeline or have already been put in place. What are some of the ways that, what is a role that Unidos US can play kind of in that process to make sure that the information finds, itself in the right hands?
Yes, I think, very similar to kind of what Matt described, because Unidos is also an intermediary. So certainly a lot of these programs, we're advocating for them at the national level, at the federal level, that they get enacted, and then we're advocating to make sure that there's equity in terms of how they're dispersed and distributed across the country. And then we work with our affiliate network to make sure that these community organizations are connected depending on how the funds are being dispersed. So it's going to vary based on the program. Also note that we have a sister organization, the Asset Development Fund, which is Unidos US's CDFI, but similarly, they can deploy the capital. So they've been, at the receiving end of some of these, significant investments, which then they can deploy in local communities.
So let me ask this question, and I'm going to open this up to, all of the questions are opened up to the entire panel, but this one I'm not asking any particular person to lead on an answer. How can we make sure that upzoning and creating new housing supply won't result in displacement?
Well, I'll start with the very specific neighborhood homes investment act legislation. This was a concern of ours, and so we actually put something into. Well, first off, we're trying to focus the communities that are not the ones that are gentrified, the ones that have low home values, as well as the high poverty and lower income families. So off the bat, hopefully we got that right, but it's also the housing credit agencies are going to be doing, the housing finance agencies will be doing their annual allocation plans and collecting applications. So they'll be able to also weed out the neighborhoods that truly need the support versus the ones that might already be popping. So we have some breaks there. But another thing we put into the selection process is that you have to consider the impact on the community, including the community residents. And that was an important point because we don't want people to be displaced. Another neat thing about neighborhood homes is that I've mostly framed it in the source of new development or rehabilitation of vacant homes, but there's also existing homeowners. You can also take neighborhood home credits for doing like a mortgage rehab loans for existing homeowners. And in that part of the program, the credit's actually more valuable. It's 50%. And it's also limited to families at or below the median income. So only 100% are below the median income. Whereas for the new housing, the purchase homes, you can be up to 140%. So we're really trying to target existing homeowners in their communities so that they can maintain their equity in their home.
No, that's critical.
I think this is a really important question, and one that I think we all have to be very aware of and intentional about in how we go about our work. Thinking about the example in California, and all the recent changes we've seen, with upzoning particularly focused on ADU development. I think the examples that I've seen in California, this is not in any way, I know we're at Urban Institute, this isn't like a scientific study, but just what I've seen anecdotally, it's almost like two types. You have the pre-existing ADU that was sort of below the radar that now with the new policy changes was able to conform and get legalized. Those, with home, that's the homeowner. And then you have the other end where a lot of the new ADUs coming up tend to happen in higher income neighborhoods, or there's a developer that buys an existing house that just happened to be, allowed with upzoning, and then they construct the new units. It's not kind of the traditional model. And so I think a lot about this question, how we can make sure that it's the homeowners, people from the community really benefiting from this. And so we have a national network of HUD certified housing counseling agencies. And so I have this dream that we can deploy our housing counselors to be in the communities, educate local homeowners in places where there is the right types of zoning policies, and help them connect them to reputable, developers, financing options, so they can take advantage of these policy changes and reap the benefits on either, any increase in value in their home, but also in a lot of these communities, these, established, communities of color. I think we heard a little about this earlier, people can't move back to the communities where they grew up in. And that's really sad. I know in my personal example, I grew up in Oakland, California. We used to spend every Sunday at my grandmother's house. All my cousins, aunts, uncles, everyone would come over. And now today, we all live all over the place, and a lot of that is because people can't afford to buy a house in Oakland anymore. And so if we can create more, inventory options in these communities, people can come back to live in the communities where they grew up, which what a lot of people want to be able to do. And so I think we need to be really intentional to making sure that the existing community residents, owners are aware of what these programs are, and that they're first in line for being able to benefit from it.
I think you bring up a really good point. I'm going to take your point and I want to juxtapose it onto another challenge related to climate. Certainly, we remember when Katrina hit, and there were those particularly communities of color who moved from New Orleans to other places, Texas, one of the places that often comes up as their destination, who never were able to move back. And so kind of David, I'm bringing you into this conversation here, that kind of resilient supply, in part, perhaps, and maybe this isn't right, but perhaps to kind of get at some of the things that Laura's talking about of, that they can come back, or talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I wish I had a better thought out answer for that question. I think we are facing a crisis that is, it isn't human nature to moderate in advance, right? The slower and slower we are responding to the climate crisis that we are still creating, the more and more we are going to have to spend in order to essentially, climate-proof our infrastructure, climate-proof our housing, and in some ways just climate-proof our lives. And I don't really think that there's a way out of that. I think the important thing to do is, much like we were talking about in the displacement conversation just a second ago, is to go into these situations with your eyes open, and by placing equity really at the center of them. We could at HUD say, like, well, we really care about climate change. We're gonna dial up all the energy codes to maximum. We're gonna, elevate everything. We're going to build everything as resiliently as possible. But we know that would be, at a certain point, extremely counterproductive to the low-income households who we're trying to make housing more affordable for. So if I have an answer at all, it's just, you really need to go in with your eyes open about kind of what the alternative consequences might be as you're doing this work.
No, I appreciate that answer. I think that's a great answer, and it's a great segue. I'm going to take a break from the questions that I'm getting from the audience, and I do have a number of questions still here, to ask a bit of a different question, hopefully a more optimistic one maybe. And this is for each of you. I mean, in an ideal world, what would success look like for you in terms of closing the boosting the inventory of single family housing and closing the racial disparities? What would that look like in terms of success? It's very much a pie in the sky kind of question.
I think one piece of it, and it's not a full answer, is reinvesting in communities that already exist. We have. So when I was at NCST, we worked on this initiative that some of you might have heard of called Middle Neighborhoods, and these are about working class or middle class neighborhoods that by and large are located in metropolitan regions that are losing population, and that tend to have a little bit of an oversupply of housing stock, or if they don't, they might soon, because it's very affordable to build out into the exurbs, rather than kind of renovating and reusing the homes that exist kind of in the urban core. I actually think that if we are going to solve the supply problem while advancing or doing something about racial equity, it's not just going to be about building new houses. It's going to be about really reassigning appropriate value to the homes that exist today, and making kind of more dense, this sort of semi-urban, row house neighborhoods. Like, I think that if we're able to leverage our existing housing stock, much of which is owned by people of color and much of which is in very bad shape, I think that's one way that we could make progress on this.
Yeah, for me, you all know what it is, right? It's reenact the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, right? Oh, more applause. Yeah, because and to your point too, one of the things I didn't mention when I talked about some of the eligible communities, I said about 20% of the census tracts were eligible. 2/3 of those eligible communities are majority minority census tracts. So this is opportunities to invest in existing infrastructure and for first time minority home buyers. I think that really does that. It's creating construction jobs in the communities. It's increasing the tax base for those communities, getting these vacant homes back to productive use. I mean, it just checks so many boxes. This would be the real victory if we could get a program like this initiated nationally.
Yeah, so I agree with all of that for sure. I'll maybe answer your question when you kind of like what would that look like? So if we kind of achieve these goals, I think about the people live where they want to live and be able to create community and have access to a quality school in their neighborhood, be able to walk to a grocery store, have access to, healthcare nearby, no matter where they live. So whether it's, east of the river here in Washington, deep East Oakland, the south side of Chicago, then, wherever we choose to make our community, that we have the same amenities and quality of life as higher income and other types of communities.
That's excellent. We've got one more question. We talked about a lot. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We had a lot of time, but we've covered a lot of ground in that time, I think. One word or one phrase. We've heard a lot. What is the number one thing that the federal government needs to do to boost housing supply?
Am I allowed to give the same answer I just did? See, I didn't know that question was coming, but this is it. I mean,
no, we'll start here, Laura.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. One thing. I think incentives for building, affordable homes for first-time home buyers.
I think we need federal government to invest. I love financing programs. I love working at a financing program, but at some point, I think we need to spend more money.
I'm sticking with my original
answer. Excellent.
Nice.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Our panelists, thank you so much. I mean, your answers, your knowledge, the subject matter expertise that you brought to this, absolutely been amazing. Thank you all for listening and for participating, those that are even virtually. We are now moving to a short break. And then please come back for our next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our moderator.